out of our settings and out of policies. And so to pair this idea of verbal talk, talking about race and racism, with body talk, so movement and performance, I went back to some of my early experiences as a doctoral student working with theater of the oppressed. And I'll talk a little bit about that and how we use it. And then Amber will say more about the actual professional development series that we provided with support from the Anchin Center and the Diversity Committee. Okay, so in working in this professional development, it was a collective of people. So it wasn't just me, it wasn't just Amber, there were students involved, but we also drew heavily on the work of the Outcast Theater Collective. And so the Outcast Theater Collective is an ensemble, a theater ensemble that's created here in the Tampa Bay area. And their focus is on integrating arts with justice. And they came in to help us, and Amber will talk more about that. But they have a very social justice centered mission. And so I'll say a little bit more in case you're not familiar with Theater of the Oppressed. So Theater of the Oppressed is based on Agosto Ball's work in theater in Brazil. And prior to that, he was also influenced by Paulo Freire. So you might be familiar with his work in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so Ball's work in one of his books, and I have it on the screen, hopefully you can see that, is Theater of the Oppressed. And so you think about taking the problem-posing approach that Freire offered and combining that with theater. So how do we make theater not just a place where people come and sit and get, but they also act? And so through his approaches, which includes games and strategies and different techniques, people have an experience. And some of it you can script, but a lot of it you can't, because it's coming out of the dialogue that's happening in that moment. And the idea is that it helps people plan for a rehearsal, if you will, a rehearsal for transformation. So it's not just talk, it's how to talk and movement, changing the body helps to change the way we think and the way we act. And so that's a little bit of a background from Theater of the Oppressed. And I'll turn it over to Amber now to say more about the professional development series that we offered.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Agosto. And this was an amazing opportunity to be a part of. And I know that some of the people on the call right now were able to experience this professional development too. So just to kind of describe what happened, in collaboration with the Outcast Theater Collective and the College of Education's Diversity Committee, the research commenced with phase 1, which was titled Graduate Student Testimonials, Opportunities to Talk About Racism. And so here, graduate students were invited to talk about their experiences with race, racism in the College of Education. And after students, and this was on a virtual Zoom setting, and after students were given the time and the space to share their personal stories related to race and racism, the whole group, so that is the theater collective, some USF alumni, Dr. Agosto and the students, we actively participated in performance. And so first, a student and a joker, a role in the performance, reenacted a scene from one of the students' stories. So the group would debrief the scene together, engaging in discussion about how the person in the oppressed role could use a more productive or beneficial strategy to navigate their situation. Kind of talking about what Dr. Agosto referenced, rehearsal for transformation. Cornelio Aguilera, who is a member of the Outcast Theater, explained to us students and people there, that one of the main points was to practice specific responses that would help those in oppressive racial circumstances respond and resist in more confident and successful ways. And so these stories in phase 1 provided a foundation for the study stakeholders to collaborate on creating a script which reflected graduate students' experiences with race and racism in the College of Ed. After the process of writing, revising, and confirming the script, the scene was then played out for the professional development with USF faculty during phase 2, which was titled Walking in Student Shoes Around Race and Racism with Faculty. And so here, USF faculty were able to critically observe, discuss, and engage with the scene themselves, identifying covert modes of racism and even partaking in the role play. So they worked together, students, faculty, researchers, Outcast Theater, to create the means for a more liberated finale. And so the opportunity for faculty to watch and debrief the scene allowed for critical and solution-based discussion of the racial issues that are impacting students in the college. So explicit focus on race and racism throughout the professional development helped to push back against those norms for silencing what are traditionally silencing of these topics. Faculty and students could work together by talking it out. Creating and practicing productive language and strategies to assist in navigating these troubling circumstances that were told by students. And so this performance-based experience for collaboration, critical perspectives, growth, learning is part of the plan for the current study that is underway in Pinellas County. Through bodily movement and performance, dialogue, problem solving, the participants will work together with researchers and the Outcast Theater to not only strategize for successful race talk, but to also generate data which will contribute to research on the racial socialization with regard to racial equity, inequity, and educational and community settings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amber. All right. So in the phase 3, I think it's important to understand that although we center talk, and in our discussion today, right, it's about talk and the race talk. The third phase was really to try to get institutional change. So how do we identify some of the issues within the college, be able to talk about them in an open way that is productive, and translate that discussion into actionable items. So we landed on a few things where we thought we could be helpful, and also in thinking about the incoming dean and continuing this conversation into our future. So I'm not going to say more about that unless you have questions later, then you can ask us. So we're going to move on a little bit more to talk about studying the race talk. So we go into the research component. And so if you remember, if you were watching at all, the presidential debates that were taking place last year, there was a time when the commentator, Kristen Welker, asked the questions at the candidates. She asked them about the talk. She said, I want to talk about the way Black and Brown Americans experience race in this country. Part of that experience is something called the talk. It happens regardless of class and income. Parents who feel that they have no choice but to prepare their children for the chance that they could be targeted, including by the police, for no reason other than the color of their skin. What Welker was referring to is most often called the race talk. So I think it's still important to distinguish the race talk from the more general phrases such as race talk, which could mean, if you just say the talk, for instance, when I first heard the talk, I think about sexual activity, the talk you have with kids about sex. Or race talk could just be more general. Any conversation that deals with race talk, is talking about race. So that's more open. But I think there's some important distinctions to keep in mind and to sort of maintain when we talk about the race talk. So the race talk has sociocultural roots in African American families, and it addresses racism. So it's not just race, but it's also racism. And more specifically, it has a protective dimension to it. And that it is often a way to teach children and youth about how to negotiate their way through society, a racist society. How to anticipate, for instance, racism or racist acts that target them, how to process that experience, and how to more generally avoid the harms of racism. Whereas simply talking about race doesn't mean that one is pointing out the structural ways in which race is used to order society and institutions. or to sort of organize which assets and deficits or with which rewards and punishments that people get back and how that gets mapped onto lived experience. So the race talk and other ways of talking about racism or avoiding it contributes to racial socialization. And so we go to the literature for this and some theory about racial socialization. And I want to point out something that you may have seen in some of our emails across the university about Sesame Street and their recent focus on racial justice. So even in their series and this in episodes they have, they're helping young children process to understand race and racial identity. So I see that as Sesame Street's approach to racial socialization. So to look at some of the literature and that we've used to support our little review for the study, Amber's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, just to provide some background on the literature around racial socialization, we're really drawing from a model that was proposed by researchers Hughes and Chen in 1997 and then Hughes and colleagues in 2006. And they described these 4 broad categories of race-related messages that parents convey to their children. And those categories are cultural socialization, and this is when parents or caregivers will teach children about their cultural heritage, customs, traditions, history, and promote ethnic and cultural pride. The second category is preparation for bias. So this is increasing awareness of bias, discrimination, so that children have coping resources and mechanisms to navigate these racist systems. Promotion of mistrust, or building a type of healthy suspicion in terms of interrelational interactions with people. And then silence about race. So these, some families will simply not communicate about race. And so although the focus is on families, these categories aren't contingent upon kinship and immediate family relationships. And so researchers Farrago and colleagues in 2019 actually stated, they argued the need to apply principles of racial socialization to school and early childhood educational contexts. So these categories can really help us provide a lens to interpret how educators are performing race talk or the race talk with youth.
So this gets at the study that we currently have underway. Our IRB is approved. We're already in the recruitment phase. And so in this study, we're trying to understand how educators in community organizations and educators in various types of schools, who we refer to as formal educators, how they talk with youth about race and racism. So that may be general race talk, or it might be the race talk. And therefore, how they contribute to the racial socialization of youth. And then how does that, or how does collaboration happen around that talk, if it does at all? And how does that support educational health and well-being of students? And so the idea driving the study was that if families participate in racial socialization, and some families give the race talk, then perhaps some formal educators also have some version of the race talk, or at least some general talk with youth around race. And so when I was thinking about it earlier, I thought about my own experience working in secondary school and asking myself, have I ever given the race talk? What did that look like? How was that different? What was the context? And how might that be different for people now with a different, broader political context? And I, asked around a few people, and I spoke with someone who was a principal, not a principal, a behavior management administrator in a school, and asked, have you ever performed what I would call the race talk? He was familiar with the race talk. And he said, yeah, I remember several times. I had an office. I would talk to youth, young Black men about this. So he went into that and said, yeah. So, in talking just sort of in general with people, I thought, okay, people maybe do this maybe more than the ones I talk to. So let's get more about this and try to answer some other questions along the way, or at least raise some other questions, such as, do educators in schools and those in community organizations talk to youth about race and racism in similar ways? And are there differences worth noting? And how can our findings help bridge the gap between schools and communities? working toward overlapping goals, sort of to ensure the educational health and well-being of youth. And so those are some questions we think we might be able to answer eventually through the study. And so it brings us to this question of why Pinellas, right? Why there? So originally, I imagined it as a larger study that would go, multi-state. But for now, we started with Pinellas, and that's supported by a grant, which Dr. Moore will be able to talk more about. So we were able to obtain that grant to support this research. But we also looked at part of our criteria for what counties we would choose across the United States had a criteria of having a public connection between the state of education in that county and racism. So we were able to look at news, the media, to find out if we could find this connection. And so if you recall, and this was a few years ago, I'm going back, where a reporter referred to some of the schools in the county, in Pinellas County, as failure factories. So that was pretty significant. But more recently, in light of some of the protests that were happening last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, there were some changes that then the superintendent, Greco, responded to. And this statement that he created for the schools implicated racism in the success or failure of the school district. And so we found other instances where, for instance, students were protesting and they were calling, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, they were calling for more attention to inequity in the schools in Pinellas County. And so that's one thing as we think about doing this study in other areas, other counties, other states, that's part of what we would be interested in, this public conversation that links racism to school achievement, underachievement, and other things like that. Another thing we looked at was a report. So to try to learn more about the county and who was interested in these kinds of questions or this study, we looked at a report on the status of youth in Pinellas. And I'll show you a little bit about, and I won't say too much about the report, but it's publicly available online. And it was created by this group called Unite Pinellas. And it's like a consortium of about 20 different organizations, AARP, the St. Pete Chamber of Commerce, and many others. So right in the beginning of that document, they make it clear that some of the issues faced in the county relate back to racism. And so I'm looking here on this document that I have posted. They say equity is the superior economic and social model. Still, disparities based on race and ethnicity endure across a host of socioeconomic indicators in our county, indicating a persistence of racial barriers to opportunity. Typically, those barriers include, and they go on to list a host of barriers in different areas across housing, etc. And so we saw that, okay, there was an interest, there were other people, other organizations interested in this conversation. And so with that, I think about the longer vision for the project is thinking about how participants, to learn from the participants and having them learn from one another. So eventually bringing them together using theater of the oppressed. And how do we pave the way for intersectoral collaboration, which simply means collaboration across sectors, so that people who are interested in health are working with those in education. Those who are interested in city planning are working with those in education. Those in education are working with those who are interested in youth development, who are interested in housing, so that people from different sectors are able to cross-communicate and problem solve to address youth development in particular and racism more broadly. So that's some of the background, and through our research, we hope to add to this conversation on what is the professional development that is needed among educators, including formal educators in school settings, to offer intersectoral, intersectional, and interdisciplinary curriculum and leadership development, where racism is named and blamed. Right. So that's a little bit about the background. And did I miss anything on our, okay, IRB, report propellants? Okay, we're good. All right, so just moving on a little bit, and then we'll have others on the panel speak as well. We're good at time. All right, so when we think about, you know, the broader context again, and the possibilities for even curriculum and leadership development. So how do we do this work, and what are some of the barriers that may be sort of down the line? And so this recent conversation around banning CRT from schools and now from higher education is sort of, you know, right there at the forefront of my thinking as we move forward with this study. And so I refer to Bonilla Silva, who writes about something called a new racism, right? So he says that America is operating under a new racial structure that includes the increasingly covert nature of racial discourse and racial practices, the avoidance of racial terminology, and the elaboration of a racial agenda over political matters that eschews direct racial references, right? So we don't want to name racism. We don't want to use those words, but we'll have a racial agenda related to political matters like no CRT, but we won't directly deal with race and racism. So this new, more covert, like it deals with race and racism, but it's not really, it's about CRT, but it's not about racism. So thinking about that, and this sort of these recent attempts to obliterate CRT by politicians, you know, following Trump's lead from earlier in the year, in the last year, to DeSantis this year, and now Idaho putting forth some House bill on the horizon. We don't know what will happen with that, but just thinking about it, the potential to expand, to learn from what we can learn from those who do this type of education in organizations with youth, right, who fight these battles daily, and thinking about how to expand that, how to learn from it, how to use it, and how to do better in our formal settings that we call schools and universities. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to present within our time so that we leave time for question and answer. I think we've planted enough seeds, but maybe I would sort of want to give attention to the grant we have, and maybe we could just take maybe 5 more minutes to do that. Dr. Moore, would you like to do that or say more about the context too?
Dr. Moore, you're muted.
I apologize. I was on mute. I apologize. Yes, I would like to say in regards to the grant, and I'll be brief because Dr. Agosto covered most of it very well. And so my piece of it is we're extending it to Pinellas to look at some of, and not only to look at some of the racial injustices and give voices to those that often feel that they're voiceless, but to also include the narratives and start bridging some of the gaps that we currently have in Pinellas County and continue to have and are continually to be exacerbated by many other things that are taking place, such as shameless murders and deaths. As I was just sitting on a NAACP meeting as we continue to have discussions about a young man that was recently killed in South St. Petersburg as an officer stood on top of a car and shot 47 bullets into this, and having conversations about the race talk and did it have anything to do with the overall act of the individual or the discussions that were taking place prior to. So I think as we continue to move forward, having these conversations and creating opportunities so that they are intersectorial, we're beginning to bridge some much needed gaps and build some professional development that is not only needed, but historically needed a long time ago. we continue to not only have segregated schools and segregated areas in our communities, but everything, we have a hyper segregation right now. And so including social, economic, health, living, as well as schools. There are so many issues that our students and our families and our children are facing, and our community members, and so many concerns. And so allowing our children and our youth of today to begin to have those voices and to begin to allow them to collaborate with many of the individuals outside of their norm, where their voice has often not been heard, whether it's within their curriculum, where they're saying, hey, I want to know about redlining. Hey, I want to know about social justice. I want to know what socialization means. I want to know the depth of racism. I want to know more about what African Americans have contributed to the United States of America, not just Martin Luther King on February. And so beginning to have these conversations about the persistent racial inequities as it relates to employment, home income, wealth, education, our justice system, our prison to pipeline, our quote unquote failure factories, where we know that the schools are extremely segregated, our transportation, our housing are allowing not only our students, but our families and the organizations at large to begin to develop not only move away from the awareness and move towards developing advocacy, and how do we begin to put things in place to begin action and moving forward. And so that's our piece for Pinellas.
And Dr. Moore, did you want to say something about the two documents? I have them up on the screen, so I'm not sure if you want to mention those now or not.
Yes, and they're kind of small. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I
make this a little bigger. This
yeah.
one? Okay.
So thank you. Recently, and you can refer to this because it is available online, and there is a link there as well. Recently, the Tampa Bay Times did an article, wanted to interview several students. However, there were only 3 students that really kind of stepped up to the plate and wanted to have these conversations about what's going on in Pinellas and what's going on in our schools, and what would you like to see changed within our schools. And these students actually, prior to that, had already developed a petition to change some of the instructional inequities that they had already seen within not only their classrooms, but many classrooms throughout their entire educational process. And so these 3 students began to sit down and develop some questions and some statements as it relates to wanting to hear their voices heard. And I won't read them verbatim to you, but they're on the screen. And as you can see, from my perspective, and having these discussions and listening to these young individuals, but wanting to have more discussions about racism, intersectionality, white privilege, what does that mean? Looking at biases, what does implicit bias means? What does it mean about microaggression? Where are we seeing it? How often are we seeing it? Why isn't it that we see anything about Black, Indigenous people of color in our textbooks? Why are we not able to see the impact that they're making? Where are their narratives? Why aren't these things being included in our history classes, in our science classes, in our math classes? Why aren't we able to have these conversations openly and freely across all content areas, and not in just maybe our social foundations class or our history classes once a year during February? And so that question came up, and that came from a much broader conversation as it relates to our COQUIP organization within Pinellas County, which from long time ago has been dealing with Pinellas County School as it relates to the social injustices and inequities as it relates to African American students. And unfortunately, this came through 2 lawsuits actually for Pinellas County. And as of right now, Pinellas County Schools developed what is also known as the Bridging the Gap Plan to suffice the lawsuits as they stand today. And as of today, some of the data that will represent shows that Pinellas are meeting or I would have to say averaging out on some of those goals. However, we have a long way to go, because what I would like to say about that piece of information as it relates to the Bridging the Gap plan, we need to ensure that we're using all pieces of data and not just select pieces of data to share with our community members. And how that data is also being shared is important as well. And so looking back and having these conversations, not only with COQUIB, not only with our district, and not only with our community members, we have to continue to have these authentic conversations, narrative conversations with our students as well, and involve them in the process, because sometimes I know we've heard of the devil is in the details. And so sometimes we have to look a little bit deeper than our data and begin to have some qualitative conversations with our students, what's going on in the school system that we may or may not be seeing in the data, and sometimes also data that we may be leaving out. I just want to say, in addition to that, Pinellas County is continuing to have conversations with our COQUIB organization as we continue to look at the Bridging the Gap plan. However, in addition to the Bridging the Gap plan, we're also having discussions about looking at our early childhood education programs as well, because we know that building a strong foundation for our children, regardless of age, will be certainly something that will be supported to them when they continue to move forward as they enter into the public or even private school sector by certain ages. And so I want to make sure that I mention that part as well. And I would like to share a quick anecdote or story that I was recently having a conversation with a young man that's in the school system, and recently was saying he was having the race talk with a group of students during a Skype meeting or whatever they're using for technology, via technology in their classroom. And the teacher actually said to him that I'm going to let you run the class today, because clearly I do not know enough about this content and you do. So I'm going to allow you to lead the conversation. And I thought that was extremely powerful for a teacher to give up power and control, because we know, all teachers, myself previously being a teacher and administrator as well, you never know what can happen when you give up power and control to students in your classroom. And to give up that power speaks volumes of that teacher's dispositions of acknowledging the lack of knowledge that she had about the race talk when it came to specific situations within a African American culture or society or community. And I told him that spoke volume for his teachers. Saying that to say, yes, that is one instance that I've seen. However, once again, we have a long way to go from there to where we would like to be. And so at the secondary level, I saw that taking place, or I was informed that that was taking place via a classroom. At the early child care, I want to say just something quick about the early child care facilities. I was in about 6 of them, most recently this week. And to see the impact that our early child care teachers and providers are having on our young children as early as 2 and 3, as it relates to the race talk. Talking about individuals that I assure you our high schoolers and some of our college students would have no idea as to whom they are and why they have such an impact. Being able to tell me as a 2 and 3-year-old why not only that Jesse Owens was in the Olympics, but the why behind it. And who did he run against? He ran against Hitler's men. And why was that important to you? And being able to connect that. And so those conversations are not only powerful, but impactful. But once again, we are moving in a direction where we continue to have these discussions in a narrative form, but we have so much more work to do. And I will let Delquanda move on to Delquanda.
Yeah, I think Delquanda is our invited guest to our panel, very knowledgeable about all of, well, you heard her bio, so I won't say more about that, but we're right at that time too, where we move into our discussion. And so I think Dr. Thompson Dorsey is going to help facilitate that.
Absolutely, and thank you for the presentation. It was quite informative and exciting. We have a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to begin us off with some questions. And I just have to say that I really feel close to this work because I had the honor and pleasure of attending some of the discussions and rehearsals with Dr. Augusto and Miss Pretz and the Outcast Theater. It was so powerful. Hearing graduate student stories about their experiences with racism in their academic programs, and of course, writing that script and putting all of that together, it brought back so many of my personal and professional experiences in academia, as well as just in other aspects of my professional life as a lawyer, practicing law at a large law firm, and undergrad, and of course K-12 experiences. So this work is important because people's stories need to be heard. So thank you. And I'm even more excited now that it is moving into Pinellas County, into some of this K-12 work, and that really makes it even more bold and exciting. So thank you. The first question I have is, how will you engage educators to participate in the study, given the governor's explicit distaste about talking about race and racism? And basically, we know that the governor doesn't really understand CRT and what it is, but he's sent a clear message to educators that they should stay away from issues of race and racism in their classrooms and in their pedagogy. So how will you get educators to participate openly and honestly?
So I would say we need to go back to his words and not put words in his mouth. So yes, not or critical. We're not. Our framework is not critical race theory. Our framework is more open. We're using racial socialization, which doesn't come out of critical race theory. And so when he says that, it's not like he's banning all conversations around race. So I wouldn't say that that is my interpretation of what has come out of his mouth. So yeah, I don't feel like that really stifles us. It's not the framework we're using. So I don't feel that we can't have conversations about racial injustice. I didn't interpret it that way. He's really right now focused on the curriculum within schools, and actually we're not working with the schools. We're not shaping the curriculum in the schools at this point. We are working with educators, but the way that we're seeking them out is through social media groups and organizations that have a social media presence. So I'll give you just an example, and this is not for Pinellas. So when I was in Chicago, there was a group, Social Justice, Teachers for Social Justice. And so that group and their online presence, whether that's Twitter account or whatever it is, we can access them, post our recruitment information through that way, and get respondents, participants in that way without working through the formal educational system. So we're not at this point encroaching on what he wants, but what he wants is not law. So I don't feel encumbered by that.
Yeah, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. And I know his words is about what he said about CRT being divisive. And so that's what would concern me is if teachers would see even this conversation about the race talk as something divisive. And but I think it's a smart idea when you go through social media because where you'll have educators who won't talk specifically about their job, but will talk about their thoughts and ideas around these issues of racial justice is a nice way to distinguish. And hopefully those are educators who also can distinguish between how they may interpret the governor's words versus the participating in your study. So thank you for that. I have one more question, and then I'm going to move to questions in the chat box. So in reading more about Pinellas County and just the different issues they've had in dealing with racism, and of course the term that is so often used when we talk about the disparities that exist in achievement between Black and white, Latinx and white students is the achievement gap. And that's common verbiage used among educators and politicians. However, many of us education researchers, including you, Dr. Agosto, I believe, who prefer the term opportunity gap, given the historical and systemic injustices that have continually occurred with regards to Black and Brown students gaining access to equitable education opportunities, including funding for schools in certain communities and rigorous and culturally responsive curricula. So what are your, all of your thoughts with regards to, in your study, really pushing this concept of opportunity gap instead of achievement gap, which seems more like blaming the students and their community, and more of that deficit perspective, pushing opportunity gap of why this race talk is important, and pushing that among the educators and even the school and district leaders in Pinellas County?
And I'll let Daquanda say a lot more about the Pinellas. And I'll just say, I also refer to the term by Gloria Ladson Billings, education debt. And so that over years, education has extracted from students, from minoritized students, has subtracted from minoritized students. And so we're left with a debt that we need to sort of make good on. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll turn it over because Daquanda really has that deep knowledge of Pinellas in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agosto. And as a spent all of my life and career born in Pinellas County. So as we see, even still on the screen regarding co-queds, as we see it, as you talked about it being an opportunity gap, the issue, as we see, has been ongoing for many, many years. And so in order to hold the district accountable, the lawsuit took place, and then mediation, like Dr. Moore said, that resulted in the Bridging the Gap plan. In order to have transformation and change, you have to be able to document and hold people accountable for the change that we want to see as a community. And the great part about it is that when we talk about, especially school and community partnerships, is that COQUEPS is of the community. The voices are of the community. I remember years ago, many, many years ago, when I first found out from COQUEPS as a mother, and I said, well, who's representing my voice? And they said, Daquanda, we need to know your views. And I ended up becoming a parent advocate as a result of learning about the work of COQUEPS. And I said, do you mean to tell me that when I was in school in Pinellas County, that there was an achievement gap? Because I was in mostly advanced classes. And you mean to tell me some of my classmates did not receive the education, the optimal education that all students are supposed to receive? And they're like, correct. So this has been going on for too long. And I do applaud COQUEPS for being that community partner to step up and to be the agitator sometimes. They go between being the agitator and the accountability partner. But in the end, we want what's best for our Black and Brown students. And if we are not partnering and listening to the voices and perspectives of those and of the community, then how can we be about transformation? So I do applaud, COQUEPS and the efforts that they have taken in order to strategize and really partner with the school district, because the Bridging the Gap is now a full partnership. Yes, it's resulted from mediation. However, it's a partnership now, and we have to be willing to take that step and get to where we want to be. The school district also has equity champions. So, also going back to the question about the CRT as well, school district has intentional equity champions with, and they study restorative practices that are highlighted in their Bridging the Gap plan. So as we're looking at those as well and talking even about race, it's going to come up through that. It's going to come up through the disproportionate behavior um, statistics that are seen in the data with the Bridging the Gap plan. It's going to come up in so many areas. I'm not sure how the district can go around that or deny it, especially with this mediation and the lawsuit with CoQuebs. There's no way to really get around not specifying, okay, we need to do something for our Black and Brown students. And what excites me about this opportunity, the race talk, is that it's time. We are in a movement. We are together. It's time to be more unified and intentional because our children need more. Our children deserve more. And when those voices, especially of our students, can be amplified, can be heard, can be listened to, can be at the table to make decisions for the education that they need in order to become the adults that they need to become, then that's when we start to see transformation and change. This is a partnership and the time is now. So I'm definitely excited to be on this panel and to hear a little bit more about this opportunity, especially for Pinellas County.
Can I
Thank you so much. Yes, yes,
I
please, Dr.
ask
Moore.
that Delquanda speak also a little bit about and share a little bit about, not only do we have CoQueb, and much like Delquanda, being a native and growing up and living in South St. Pete my entire life, I wanted to share also a little bit about the only subcommittee of CoQueb.
The only subcommittee of CoQuebs is the School Readiness Committee that started over 10 years ago. There was vested interest with CoQueb's leadership, along with Congresswoman Kathy Castor. At the time, I was with the Juvenile Welfare Board. I served on that committee. The late Yvonne C. Reed, the late Clarence Gibbons, Dr. James McHale at the University of South Florida as well, along with other grassroots providers, Imagination Station. We met in a little corner, a little office to say, okay, we need to look at early learning. Our babies are not going to school ready for kindergarten. What are we going to do about this? This is an issue because the district was telling us as the community that children weren't coming to school ready for kindergarten. And so we pushed that back into the community and we came up with various strategies in order to share with the community. Our goal was initially to reach those families that were not going to VPK, that were not in schools, that they were staying home with their families. So we just celebrated our 11th annual Baby Talk event, and that is to really provide the community and families with practical tools that they can use to get their children ready for school. And it stems off of the brain development. We know that if children could learn more words, they can grasp that concepts, they can build upon that. That is just one tool that gets them ready for kindergarten. So yes, school readiness is the only subcommittee, and we know it starts early. The Pinellas Education Foundation, we just released our report also with a Pinellas County early learning scan to say, okay, we know there's an issue. We know that children, the same issues, children are not entering kindergarten as ready as we would like them to. But guess what? They're not entering VPK ready either. They're not entering the 3-year-old class either. So what are we going to do about it? And how do we address that collectively? There are so many partners, community partners at the table. We need to remember to have that we have the families at the table too. And that's what we strive to do in all of these environments.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you,
You're
Delquanda.
welcome.
And my reasoning for asking her to speak just very quickly
Yeah.
about the subcommittee that I've served on with her as well is because of what Dr. Agosto said earlier. It's so important that we begin to bring all of these different entities together so we can stop playing the blame game. I know that I have learned so much just from the oppression theater through Dr. Agosto. And so bringing all of this together to one hash it kind of leaves out, no one has an excuse. And so thank you for sharing that about our children.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So there we do have some questions in the chat. And Rachel Hatton asked, she's one of the panel, can talk a little bit more about the theater of the oppressed as a method for talking about race. Could the panel recommend this as a way for students and teachers to explore issues of race and racism?
Definitely. Yeah. So I love that it centers oppression. So all forms of oppression. So singular forms, multiple forms, if you want to think intersectionality. Yeah, and people I know do the work with youth in high schools. I know that people have published around it. You know, usually the issue is because there's this sort of the theory behind it is that you enter as experiential and you are a spect actor. No spectator. Not like the old theater, you go in, you sit down, everybody else does the work and you just take it in. So this idea is like, no, you come in, you participate. So we have the joker or jokers, the facilitators, who do all kinds of things to facilitate. And then you have the spect actors. So the problem with, I won't say it's a problem, but the reason why it becomes so mysterious, I think, is that people want to see it. They want to watch it. They're like, what is it? I hear about it, but I don't know what it's like because it's experiential. You just watching it is not the same thing as you being there. And because it's about acting, not spectating, then if you create something for others to view who weren't there, then you're promoting the idea of spectatorship and not acting. So, if you want to experience it, you can actually contact us. And we still work with Theater, Outcast Theater Collective to do different sessions for different groups. We're working with the YWCA in Arizona, and one of our former students in Ed Leadership and Policy Studies, and another one in Western Michigan. We're collaborating and working on grants. And because of COVID, it's all virtual. So usually it's using the body in space where you're touching, connecting, you're creating images about reality with other bodies, not just your own. So it's that kind of, we don't have that. It's really difficult when you're limited to this Zoom space or this team space, whatever the video is. So we had to give up some of that and some of those games that we would do, that demechanization of the body that happens. But we figured out how to do some other things in the virtual setting. And that's all really exciting. So if you're interested in, like, you actually want to experience it, you can let us know, because when we have other events, like I attended one, I wasn't a joker, I wasn't jokering it, I wasn't a participant. I just wanted to see how my colleagues were doing to facilitate the dialogue, which is a difficult part of it. It's like you do something and then is it just silence or what? How do we move the conversation? How do we help people process? How do we acknowledge people's emotions in those moments? So those kinds of things. We've been working, several of us, we meet for the most part every week to improve our facilitation. And that's really our focus. What did you do? Why did you do that? Why would you do that? How you might do that differently? And what are some of the techniques that we could use, not as a package, but knowing that we have to be responsive to the people who are there, to what they're experiencing. So it's not just a scripted thing, but that's our focus. And so if you want to, the way I went into that session last week, just as a visitor, but I participated as well. So it's not like I'm just going in and I'm sitting back in the cut just watching, like letting them do the work. No, I actually was in. I was put into a breakout room and I had to have this performance with this other person who turned out to be like an administrator of the whole organization. And I didn't know that, but well, she
No
enjoyed
pressure.
it.
Right.
That was a good thing. So it worked out. but we could invite you to participate, not just to spectate.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
just to piggyback on what Dr. Augusto said, as a colleague, I participated in it as well. And I will have to say, just our human nature, you're very curious. Your students will be very curious, as we were, about what's taking place if you choose not to participate, because you can't have your camera on to see the other actors if you have not been an actor. You have to be actively engaged in it. And so you're very curious about what's going on. So it leads you to want to participate, and it also to using those strategies to be able to tell stories and discussions, and the body movement. So I just want to say it's a really impactful part of a learning and being able to discuss, because I can automatically say the first thing I wanted to do in this presentation was use sign language. And I didn't think that would be fair for others. And so I had to think again about how to use something different, but how the body would talk without being verbal. And so I absolutely loved it as a colleague in participating in it.
Oh yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
if in case you're interested, would this be appropriate for your group? I'll say just a little bit, and I'm going back to when I was doing it in Wisconsin, which is a little different context than Tampa, but we did it at a conference with union organizers. And usually we're talking at least 2 hours, about 3-4 hours, and sometimes we're talking about 2 days. Here on campus, we did a 2-day session, about 4 hours each day in a class for administrators, principals, and district administrators. And by the end of the session, they wanted us to come to their schools and to their district during the summer. And it was more work than we could handle at that time, because there were only like 5 of us. But we done it with teacher preparation at Edgewood College in Madison. We done it with the sociology department, academics and TAs at UW. We did it with residential life, and their housing situations they were having. So many different contexts. And we just cater to some of the issues that are happening within whoever the group is that's bringing us in.
Oh, that's good. Well, I will say that I want to participate again and be involved, and not as a spectator, but actually actively involved. I think I've shared with you, Dr. Augusto, my love of acting and theater, and
Yes.
of course,
Yeah.
I'm all about anti-racism and anti-bias, and doing something more positive to address it. So this is just wonderful.
Yeah. It's the
Getting me
only drama
excited talking about
I
it. Right. So, yes, and of course we'll have to talk later about how maybe you could facilitate some of this as PD for teachers and administrators through the Anchin Center. So, I'll be calling on you for that. Okay, so we have another question from Lindsay Parson. We have worked to embed anti-racist teaching work in our literacy coursework here at USF. We address equity and literacy specifically through conversations about topics like ratio-linguistics and racial bias and assessments, for example. This week, we included an NPR video about redlining in our undergraduate coursework. So I think my question follows along the same lines as Rachel's. Can you suggest any particular topics or resources you all think we should include in the literacy courses that may be outside of literacy specifically, but missing from other work we are doing with undergraduate pre-service teachers here at USF?
And I give my colleagues a moment to think about that. And I know Amber in particular has some experience with the teacher prep program. It has more of a sort of an insider view into that. So maybe you'd want to take that one to begin with.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat, and I don't have any real answers to that. There's individual resources like Dr. Augusto shared, the Sesame Street resource about talking about social justice. And just this question made me really go back to one of the first meetings I had with Dr. Augusto, where she said this content, this curriculum is a supplement. And so just taking a step back from, the class, and I know that this is really a programmatic issue that needs to be evaluated. But like when you step away from the class, how can you really expand the center so that this content becomes a part of that center? I think is a relevant approach to look at. Another thing that comes to mind is I just did a presentation on teacher stress, and it's showing up in our pre-service teachers as it relates to burnout. And so Michael Apple talks about this theory, intensification, where we're piling more things on for teachers, but we're not giving them the resources to maneuver, navigate, deal with all of these things. And so, yes, these are topics that need to be put into classrooms, but when I'm their supervisor, and so I see where it shows up in practice, and it's just not showing up in practice because I really do feel like, we need to be taking care of our pre-service teachers in holistic ways. And so I know that's not just literacy, like that's really programmatic. And so I'm interested in what that would look like as well. And just one more thing that I would say is Dr. Moore talked about talking about race and racism and going into the why and personal connections that people have. And so you really need to look at as well, we need to look at the fact that education is predominantly white middle-class women. And so when you are asking them to do this work, how are they connecting to it beyond savioristic narratives for Black and brown students? And so really starting from the inside out and not just starting with I think we have to start wherever we're at, period. But it's both and, we are giving you this historical context, this important political context, but also we're working on us. And so, yeah, I think it is a holistic program question that you've asked, but those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah.
If I can also just make a quick comment too, the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg, and I believe Tampa is familiar with this, has been providing Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversation sessions, and to be able to teach protocol about how do you talk about race? How do you have a conversation? How do you identify and center yourself on the compass before you start it? We want to be mindful as we are going into these conversations, but we also need to be equipping with the tools in order to navigate these conversations. Whether you have the experience or not, we should be able to center ourselves and navigate through these conversations, because at times they can be uncomfortable. At times we may not always understand where another perspective is coming from. However, we have to be open and have those tools and practices in place. And I'll be happy. They have a session coming up actually next month, and May 13th and 14th as well, if anyone is interested in those Courageous Conversations protocol session.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Can I just add something to support what Amber as well as Delquanda said? I also think it's fundamental that we also remember that our pre-service teachers as well as our in-service teachers, they only know what they know. And so they're leading, guiding, teaching, instructing, whatever they're doing from their sense of where they are from, whatever their own dispositional attributes are, they're connecting those to what they know. And so I think it's important to once we have the conversation about what are your personal dispositions, because if they grew up a certain way and that's all they know, then we have to begin those conversations so that they can see the disconnects between where they were to where they're at and to where they need to be. And so I do agree with everything the lady said. I think first and foremost is understanding who you are as a person, and so that you can begin to have those conversations and connect with the environment that you're currently in.
Right. Yes. So Dr. Prasan also had followed up with a connecting question. Do you think there's any chance someone from Theater of the Oppressed might visit our courses virtually or offer some resources to lead a discussion like this?
Yeah, I think that the work that you're doing around racial linguistics ties in nicely, because a lot of this, like I said, given COVID, it's gone virtual. So we have a lot more that's actual talk than it is with the body. And so paying attention to how language is racialized might be a good way for people to engage with that content matter that you're interested in, as well as the way people perform racism through language. And the other piece would be through the body. So Theater of the Oppressed also has the body focus. And when we do more of the face-to-face work with actual physical bodies, then using your racial linguistic lens to think about body talk, body communication, body gestures, facial expressions, the 90 whatever percent of our communication. So that might be a way to sort of tap into the theater of the oppressed with the emphasis on performance, talk, and the body as well. So yeah, sure. So just email me and then we can talk about what you need, how much time you can devote to it, and then figure out what would be appropriate, given what your needs are.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So Dana Roberts also has a question. And since I see your camera's on, you can't hide now. Would you like to ask your question directly?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Thompson Dorsey. And this has been really, really amazing. Sorry to be a few minutes late. Hi to some of the faces that I may have been in the same room with at various times. I'm just wondering, given what we've been saying over the last hour and a bit, is the US education system actually working for anyone?
Well, it depends on which purpose you have in mind. I think the educational system serves several purposes. Some of them, like to have a democratic, citizenry and to ensure economic health of the nation and et cetera, et cetera. So there are about 4 different purposes. And I think it serves some better than others. I think it underserved some people. But I think one important piece is that some people who are underserved by the institution have other outlets. They have other options for learning. Others who are underserved don't have those same options. So yeah, we probably could do a better job for everybody, but we do a horrible job and have done so for a very long time for some people. So I wouldn't want to lose sight of that. Or say that it's all bad. There might be a few areas where we seem to get it right sometimes for some people. That's my 2 cents.
I do have a follow-up.
Okay.
So I really liked what Amber said about basically about embodiment, and I think Professor Agosto also really talked about it as well. We basically, as a society, have tried to shove people into silos, and this whole idea of the Enlightenment and dualism and things like that. So really, we have lost sight of a holistic being that we live within our bodies and our capacity to do well by ourselves and our families and the community we live in. That's where my question was really coming from, because I'm really, really happy to hear some of the things that Professor Moore talked about and Delquanda talking about in terms of Pinellas. And really, it could be a model for the rest of the United States. We are off track as a society. We have forgotten that people need to understand where they are socially and emotionally, and there is nothing happening. I would be categorical about this. Nothing happening in any of the schools for some reason. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Because just as I was getting to the point, there's nothing happening around social emotional learning. And I guess I'm going to just throw that out there. If nothing's happening, none of us are getting the proper education we get. And I come from an early childhood education background. So, you know, I go in the orbit of Jamie McHale and a bunch of the other people, Delquanda that you talked about. But simply put, we're not teaching any of our kids, regardless of their racial and ethnic background, on how to get along.
Mm-hmm.
Over to the panel.
Right. Now I'm going to I'm sorry, Daquan.
I just wanted to make a comment to that because you're right, early learning, and that's where that social emotional needs to be taught. I participated with the Pinellas County School District on some interviews. They are hiring coaches to, work with other early learning VPK classroom teachers, and they had exercises that they had to complete for the interview process. And some we were very impressed with because it stemmed around equity and it stemmed around social emotional. So I just wanted to let you know that that is becoming of priority. It's like, where are we meeting the students where they are? Where are we learning as adults and teachers to teach the students, and really having a better understanding of it? And how are we looking at equity in general? So I was excited that that conversation, and excited to be a part of those interviews as well. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I just add a little bit that the conversation makes me think about trauma. And I feel that based on what I've been reading lately, there's a lot of attention to trauma. And I think that does connect to social emotional health and well-being. I think there's less attention to political trauma. And I'd like to see more of that. I feel like the trauma narrative is often just very psychological and winds up getting to the point where students are traumatized, they are damaged. And so there's not much we can do for them. So I see sort of that narrative unfolding, and I'm not appreciative of it. But I think the political trauma is something that is, spans generations, and we can think about that. So how is what we're experiencing in terms of our politics? And I was just writing something with one of the Surgeon Generals made this comment, and he talks about political trauma, and it's worse than any disease for various reasons, and I won't go into those. But there is some thinking about political trauma, and I'll say, when I was putting together the page where I had the talk when the presidential candidates, the debate, and they were asking about the race talk, I felt, when I started to read a little bit around it, I didn't even want to. I felt like, no, I can't go back to that. I don't want to hear that anymore. I don't want to see it. So I had to stop and just take the picture I needed and put it in the document. And it made me think about political trauma.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
just
Yes.
I was just going to add for you, Dr. Roberts. I agree with you. We have not done enough work around social emotional learning, especially for our African American students, who we know have two barriers. The race barrier and the achievement barrier, and then we have our Hispanic students that also have the language barrier. That's also included in that as well. Bettina Love talks about in her book about how African American students, it is not often that they have the language to explain to their uncultured teachers about what's going on in their culture. And so I think that speaks volumes to what's going on in some of our schools today, as well as outside of our schools. But to begin is to begin to allow our students, that universal design for learning is to be able to address their teachers and also others in a manner that is authentic to them. And so we have to begin where it's real to them. It makes sense to them. It connects to them. And so I think we must begin, that is something that allows our students to feel the realness of it as we continue to develop those relationships with them as well. We are absolutely not where we need to be with social emotional learning. And that's also why we continue to have more students labeled as exceptional or emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, which also increases our prison to pipeline. And so it's just a cyclical process that continues to happen. And so we have a need as to where we need to go, but how to get there, I don't see a plan as to where we're going at with it.
Yeah. And, I really appreciate all those responses and, as a follow-up to what Dr. Augusto and Dr. Moore shared, Dana, is the educational system is operating as it's supposed to. It's not changed. Its model has not changed, because it is a model built on white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. It does not care about students' trauma or political trauma, racial trauma, social emotional care. That was not the purpose of education in the first place. And now that it's more Black and brown and low income students being educated, particularly in urban schools, they still don't care, because that was not the purpose of education. So for those who have the access to all the AP and IB and higher level courses to become leaders of society, they're being served. But Black and brown students, students with special needs or who are being overrepresented in special ed programs, who are from low income neighborhoods, are being served as they've always been served, which is as little as possible. So it's up to us to change that.
Yes, and thank you for that, Dr. Dana. But if we're not serving everyone, we're serving no one, because we're not leading the way.
Yes, yes. So we have another question from Dr. Lauren Bronstein. She's thanking you all for a fantastic panel and all the work you're doing. But she's also wondering how your project will engage with zero tolerance policies and school to prison pipeline, as well as racial disparities.
Yeah, so we want to know how people are having the race talk with students, or talking about race in general with students. And we want to know if that's relevant to them. What are some of their concerns? What motivates them to talk about it the way that they do? And what are some of the sort of angles they bring to that work? And so we're not going in saying that people are connecting the race talk to the crib, to whatever you want to call it, a prison pipeline. But if they do, that's what we're looking for. What motivates them? What are some of the broader issues that they tap into? What are the rationales that they have? Is it just because someone told them this is what you have to do? Or do they have personal concerns? Do they even have their own children? Do they have a race talk as part of their growing up experience? Does that inform, or has that changed? And so we've already had, I'll say, at least one interview that speaks to some of that, or a lot of what I just said. So I'm really excited about that. I'm also worried that we want more participants, and I don't know that they trust somebody from USF who says that they are a professor doing research to have these conversations with. So we're going to have to really take our time and continue, and then we also have snowballing as part of our recruitment process. So hopefully once we have a few people, they can encourage others to participate in the study. And so our timeline was to do the data collection during the summer, but it might actually extend beyond the summer. For now, we're still optimistic that it will pick up more in the summer too, as we finish and close out this semester. But it's not necessary. That's part of the issues. And when we go back to, like, when the superintendent says we need a racial equity plan in the district, and we need to talk about achievement gaps and to correct those things, the pipeline to prison is part of that conversation. And it's part of the organizations that work together that want to see that doesn't happen. And so how is it taught a socialization process, a protective process that keeps that from happening? And how can going back to some of the other talk, how can theater of the oppressed, and Dana and I, we've had some conversation about this with the school to prison pipeline for girls of color, and how can them having the experience of talking, communicate with their bodies, processing, feeling, emoting, sharing that, empathizing with others, help them work through some of those situations with teachers who may be bullies, who may be sort of antagonizing them to act out in ways that they then persecute. So that might be something on the horizon, something I could see working with youth directly. In our study now, we're not working with youth directly, we're working with educators, but it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. Do we have any other questions? No, I don't see any more in the chat. So then I'm wondering then, based on what you said, Dr. Augusto, that the study, it actually incorporates talking with teachers, but not with students directly. Is there a plan for any type of follow-up that engages students and their experiences of how they live the race talk in their reality once they have it, once they learn about it? And is it something that benefits them from hearing it from family and the education system or their teachers, or not? Is that something that's going to be underway?
Yeah, that's not something we have planned. It's not in this IRB, but it's interesting to work with the adults and ask them about their experience with the race talk, and to hear how they had that with their parents, and what they saw as the limitations of that, how they use that, or how the race talk is not just from the parents, it's from other family members. So having sort of maybe contradictory talks that are going on. Maybe some are more like you have to assimilate, and some are no, you have to fight back. So we are learning about the race talk. We can learn as we go on, right? About the race talk from people who actually have had that given to them and have processed that and either used it or disregarded or adapted it, and then maybe used it with other youth. So I see that as a possibility, instead of looking at immediately you had a talk and so now what? It's like, okay, I had this talk 10 years ago with my family, not just at one time, right? Several times, but it's been a while. And now I'm working with youth. How does that inform what I do now?
Yeah. Yes. Wonderful. Wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Bronstein, for sharing in the chat. For those of you who are interested in the book talk on Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom, the Diversity Committee will be sponsoring that book discussion on Friday at noon. And yes, and Dr. Moore and Perez will be leading that discussion. I'm so looking forward to it. Let's see. Okay, so please, for those of you who are interested, get that information from the chat. So well, first of all, I'm going to ask, does anyone else have questions, any of our participants who have not had an opportunity to type it into the chat? If so, feel free to raise your hand or unmic, yourself and share, or unmute rather. Wow. Okay. Okay. I don't see any other questions.
There's a hand in the chat, I think.
Is there?
Dr. Smith.
Hi there.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I joined a little late. It's so great to be able to join this conversation and to just hear, the lovely kinds of ways that we need to be thinking about doing this work. And I'm just very excited to hear about the potential connections between Dr. Agosto, your model, and transracial linguistics. I think I came in just when you were talking about the idea of embodiment and how gestures, which are part of multimodality in our field, really, play into this work. And I think that literacy, thinking about it broadly, through what you're doing, is a powerful way to teach students how to process emotions and how to respond in ways that do not jeopardize themselves, despite the fact that they shouldn't have to, right? And it's also a wonderful way to teach teachers how their talk and their body language is being interpreted by students who are racialized. And so I think that there's a powerful opportunity here, from at least from my literacy lens, like I think Dr. Person was talking about, to really pursue some of that work. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what you do with it, and to supporting whatever that looks like. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining in.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Dr. Smith. Dr. Carranza also has her hand up.
Thank you for the amazing panel. I really enjoyed it. I know I participated in the panel that you had with the faculty, and I have been part of a few of other panel of Theater of the Oppressed performances before. But as Patriana was talking, I was thinking that one way to empower especially girls and young men in high schools who are on the receiving end of racism and disproportionate punishment when it comes to school discipline, that using theater of the oppressed as a way for them to process, to think, to be empowered could be something that I know that it's not part of this research project because, a research project cannot do everything, but I think, perhaps in working with schools or with organizations, this could be something in the future to empower community and to empower youth, to talk back, to find solutions and empower themselves against a racist educational system.
Yes, thank you for that.
And I'd say a little bit of that work does happen, not with me or this project, but from the Outcast Theater Collective. At least one member has been for, I don't know, maybe 7 years now, volunteering, hosting a youth group using theater of the press techniques and general traditional theater. And he's taken youth to the Strass Centers for their festivals. They've competed with adult collectives, and so that's just amazing sort of to watch. And I think about, try to think about where they will be. And they're mostly from migrant communities in the Dade City area. So that, that might be another sort of opportunity or connection, and people might be interested in looking at what that has meant for youth.
Dr. Smith, do you have your hand raised again? You have a question or comment?
An old hand.
It's an old hand? Okay. So Dr. Agosto, I have a question too about Outcast Theater and the work that that they do as part of the theater. Do they have different performances that address issues of oppression, not just around theater of the press, but just plays or that they may put on for for people who are just interested in seeing dramatic ways of addressing oppression or anti-oppression?
Oh, yeah, they do. And they're also starting to host on their website some other performances that you can sort of buy a ticket and view. So they're recorded and they're there for consumption. So they're doing that. So they do have a performance. And as the theaters open up more, actually, they'll be in the theaters. They're okay. Actors. They're like, real-time state actors. So this is just something that's sort of became more focused as they were sort of, contained at home, and they were able to do this, and hopefully it will continue just as strong, because they just met with a group, somebody who was a funder who wants to fund them, that's related to one of those big corporations, or was related, something like that. So yeah, so if you're interested, of course I can share, and if you have now an area on the website, for instance, I can attach something there, or at least a link where people can go. They focus on healthcare, transgendered experiences with telehealth, employment issues, women of African descent in employment and exploitation, things like that. So yeah.
Oh, wonderful. So they will be opening up in a theater again soon?
Yeah, they're individual actors that come together for the collective. They get hired to do performances like at the Straz and those other places, like theaters, like face-to-face, like stuff. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I just want to add to what Dr. Agosto was saying, or not even add, but get some more insight as well. As I've learned so much about theater of the oppressed and looking at it from our youth's perspective, as we know, TikTok, if you're not aware of it, social media for children and adults or whoever, just looking at the work that we're doing right now, and I often think about the work that our youth and adults and seasoned individuals that are doing via TikTok. I can only imagine Theater of the Oppressed being an outlet for those individuals that feel as they are being oppressed in some sort of racial circumstance, whether it's at school or in the community, and being able to produce that and then put it out via something like TikTok. So I just, it's just so amazing about so many things we can do. As I was reading the Monahan report and sharing it with someone other day, and then Harvard did a side study from the Monahan report, and we know that's from 1965, 50 years ago. We're still no better or moving our children forward than we were when that report, of course, sickening report was written. However, we can continue to move our students and our children and our families and our grandparents forward in a way that is authentic to them via those social media things that they are actively engaging in now.
Yes. Do we have any other questions from our participants?
And we are over time, aren't we?
I think is it 6 to 8, Rachel? Or is it 6 to 7:30? You're right, because it's 7:40, almost 7:45 now. So
yeah, 7:30 is.
Was that
7:30? So we are a little over time, but it's been wonderful.
I'm sorry.
So thank you. No, thank you so
I
much.
just want to keep talking. I'm sorry. I'm just so loving this. Okay, so then I won't keep us any longer. Rachel, would you like to close us out, or would?
Sure thing. Yep. I was also enjoying the conversation and didn't notice the time till just a minute ago. So I'm sorry, I've got a sunburst coming through my window there. Sorry about that. But I want to thank Dr. Agosto and the panel. It was truly a wonderful time. It's not often that you get to say that you lose track of time in a webinar. So that's really a testament to the power of your work and how inspiring it is to hear everything that you're doing for teachers in the area. I also want to echo Dana Thompson-Dorsey's offer. We would love to do more work with you through professional development offerings in the Anchin Center. So for sure, we will follow up with you about that. And we appreciate your time as well as all of the participants who joined us tonight. So thank you so much to everybody here and for your continued support of the Anchin Center. And it was wonderful to elevate the work of this panel tonight. So thank you to everybody and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Shout out to the students, Amber and Oquanda. They're doctoral students, doctoral candidate Oquanda. But yes, thank you. Wonderful. Ed Leadership and Policy Studies. Woo-hoo.
That's right.
So excited. Thank you all. We
Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you all.
Good night. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.